Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, Director of Curatorial and Educational Affairs for Battleship New Jersey.
And I'm Libby Jones, the Education Manager on the battleship. Today we're talking about destroyers. We're almost finished with our series on different types of ships, so if you haven't seen them, check the rest of our previous episodes of The War at Home. So Ryan, what's a destroyer?
Destroyers started out as small escort vessels, and they have in the last century or so grown to be full-size, almost capital ships by some estimates.
So you say in the last 100 years, what did they look like before 100 years ago? What kind of ships are we talking about here?
So there was no precedent for destroyer-type vessels prior to the modern steel and engine-powered Navy. And the weapon that brought the destroyers about was the self-propelled torpedo, as opposed to the torpedo of the mid-19th century, which was in fact what we would today call a mine. So initially, mines were called torpedoes. They sat in the water, they exploded when they were hit. Right around the turn of the 20th century, a little before, a self-propelled torpedo was invented, and then shortly thereafter, the moving ones became torpedoes, and the not moving ones became mines.
If you want to know more about mines and torpedoes, we actually have 2 separate videos about that as well. So check the rest of our channel. We will link them in the description.
So initially, torpedoes were arming pre-dreadnought type battleships, armored and protected cruisers, those sorts of ships. All of these vessels had a broad range of armaments, and that included torpedoes, and even a ram bow if they got close enough and the torpedoes didn't work. A torpedo is a relatively short-range weapon, can only shoot a couple of miles compared to a ship's guns, which can shoot over the horizon, or a modern-day missile, which can shoot hundreds of miles. So initially, even though all these ships had them, because of the range of guns, they were not getting in range to use them. So the solution for this, especially for smaller navies that couldn't afford a whole pre-dreadnought type battleship, was to arm a small, fast surface vessel with a torpedo tube, and hopefully it could race in and fire its torpedo point-blank range and race out.
How successful are those early torpedoes?
They weren't so great. There were a lot of issues. Oftentimes, these torpedoes were mounted so that they would fire broadside out of the hull of a ship, and if that ship was going at any speed, the torpedo being ejected from the tube would be caught by the current of the ship moving and sort of jam itself in there. If they hit an enemy ship, they would be extremely effective because ships at that time did not have torpedo defenses like World War II era vessels were designed to, and they didn't have the same sort of internal compartmentalization as, say, an Iowa-class battleship with 1,100 separate watertight spaces.
Can we circle back here for just a minute?
Mm-hmm.
Who had a bow that they could ram other ships with, and why?
Most pre-dreadnought battleships and new Navy type ships around the turn of the last century had a ram type bow.
Was that successful? Did anybody ever actually do that? Okay.
In combat, they never really got close to doing that. Older ironclad style ships that were still fighting at point blank range, so their smooth bores could punch through enemy armor plate, did get close enough to ram each other, and that happens even into the late 1800s. The only times that more modern pre-dreadnought type steel-hulled warships ever rammed and sank other ships were when they accidentally did it when they were steaming in formation and somebody turned and accidentally got rammed by a friendly ship.
Now that would never happen to an Iowa-class battleship, though, us running into things.
We don't have ram-type bows, so it wasn't all that terrible.
What's the story? Tell the story.
So the battleship Wisconsin was operating in heavy fog and the destroyer USS Eaton was zigzagging or in some other way maneuvering and ended up coming in front of Iowa and, Wisconsin, and got a lot of the superstructure destroyed, had some casualties on board, damaged the bow of Wisconsin pretty badly, and they had to, see if I can use my Iowa-class model here, this part of the bow was peeled away. You should look for pictures of that. So they had to cut off the incomplete bow of the Iowa-class battleship Kentucky, which was still under construction, and it had only been built up to second deck here. So they basically cut all of this out of Wisconsin and took it off of Kentucky and grafted it on. Now, because of that, there is a rumor that Wisconsin is now the longest battleship ever built. In fact, her length was not changed because this part of the ship up here was not replaced. In fact, if you go visit her in Norfolk, Virginia today, you can even see an indent in the deck where this got compressed back in the ramming, and it was never fully repaired. New Jersey is still, according to the Navy, the longest Iowa-class battleship at 887 foot 7 inches. Wisconsin never got to the length that some people claim erroneously, which is 887 foot 11 inches.
Now, we did collide with another ship, however, and it happened to be a destroyer. But things turned out a little bit differently.
With us, I can't remember the story exactly. We were either anchored or just coming out of port, and the other destroyer sideswiped us, or we sideswiped them, and our anchor, which is projecting from the bow of the ship, ripped up a bunch of their superstructure.
How'd that work for them, and how'd that work for us?
We needed some more paint on the bow.
And how'd the destroyer fare?
Needed some repairs to the superstructure.
I believe it killed the captain, didn't it?
I think he was the only casualty, and he wasn't on duty at the time. He was in his at-sea cabin.
So that gives us an interesting sense of comparison, though. How big are these destroyers we're talking about, these World War II era destroyers?
All right, so in 1/700 scale, here's a World War II sized battleship, and here is a destroyer-sized ship in the same scale. So roughly 1/3 the length. When you talk about displacement, a ship like this would displace approximately 2,000 tons. A ship like this displaces 57,000 tons. One of our gun turrets, a gun turret here, the whole 3-barreled revolving structure which descends 5 stories into the ship, displaces about 2,200 tons. It's the same as a Fletcher-class destroyer.
Small ships. You can imagine where they got the nickname tin cans.
Exactly. They tend to not have much armor plate.
Okay, so far we've talked a little bit about where destroyers originated from. We've gotten to the point where they're firing torpedoes broadside. That's causing problems. What happens next?
So it was the non-destroyers that were firing torpedoes broadside, the battleships and cruisers. So this new type of ship is developed, the torpedo boat, which is just a small power boat that carries a torpedo. And there aren't any wars during this period to test these with, but everybody's super concerned that their pre-dreadnought battleships are now vulnerable to torpedo boats. So all of these navies start to build torpedo boat destroyers. So the torpedo boat destroyers have both small quick-firing guns to engage enemy torpedo boats, but then if they end up running across an enemy cruiser or battleship, they also have torpedoes of their own. So this is one of the few times in naval history where instead of one ship evolving into a larger family tree, you have multiple ships evolving into a single type of ship. With the coming of the torpedo boat destroyer and arming it also with torpedoes, you no longer needed smaller, lighter torpedo boats. So that type of ship phases out basically within a decade of it coming into existence, and the torpedo boat destroyer just becomes the destroyer.
So what time period are we looking at here? This is World War I?
We're still before World War I at this point.
Okay.
The first dreadnoughts are probably just now being built around 1906.
Okay.
And those ships are being armed with small quick-firing guns to protect themselves against torpedo boats and also the larger main battery guns that you would associate with a battleship.
Okay. So then what happens?
World War One, these ships get bigger and bigger. And by the end of the war, a lot of them are in the 750-ton to 1,000-ton range. And this is when they start to get the features that make them still viable today. Whereas battleships only ever were designed for one thing, fighting other battleships. And then that made them go obsolete when that was no longer necessary. Destroyers started to get more and more uses thrown onto them. And that ability to take this small, cheap, light vessel and put different mission modules on it, so to speak, made them useful ad infinitum, which is why they're still in use today. So the first new task these ships got was anti-submarine warfare. So during World War I, submarine warfare comes into its own. Battleships, cruisers, they don't really have any defense against submarines. So you need a small surface ship that can go pretty fast, that you can build a lot of to protect all of your other ships. And so the destroyers were already readily at hand, and you can put sonars on them to detect enemy submarines. You can put anti-submarine weapons on them, at this time, depth charges.
Tell me a little bit more about depth charges. I really don't.
So a depth charge, especially during World War I, basically looks like a big cylindrical garbage can or a 55-gallon drum. It's this big drum. In American service, they tend to be about 600 pounds at this time. It's filled with explosives, originally TNT, later Torpex, torpedo explosive, which is more waterproof. And it's got a pressure sensor inside. And there is a rack on the back of the ship, which you can sort of see in this model here. These two racks would each hold 13 depth charges. And basically, you hear an enemy submarine on sonar, you try to sail directly over it, you set a dial on this depth charge for, hey, I'm guessing it's about 100 feet underwater. Tick, 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 tick. You roll depth charges off of the rack, off the back of the ship, and then you hightail it out of there because there's going to be a big explosion. When those reach a certain depth, the pressure of water on the depth charge is picked up by the sensor, that dial that you turned, and so it explodes there. And if you guess the depth right and manage to drop this depth charge near your submarine, the explosion sends out a shock wave which would buckle the pressure hull of the boat and cause it to implode.
So we don't do depth charges on the battleship.
Correct.
Why? Because we just can't get out of there fast enough?
That's part of it. You got to be able to run away from your depth charge or you're going to blow off your rudders and propellers. Two, we've got no way to detect a submarine. Battleships are so large and so loud as they're moving through the water that using sonar is virtually impossible. So if we can't detect a submarine, what good are weapons that are going to be used against a submarine going to be? All of our ammunition is stored in armored magazines deep inside the ship. We don't want to have a bunch of 600-pound explosive garbage cans all over the deck where if we get hit by an enemy battleship, there's a much larger explosion that does more damage.
So how do we protect ourselves against the submarines then?
By surrounding ourselves with lots of light, cheap destroyers.
Ah.
So battleships don't operate alone. We would operate with a screen of destroyers surrounding us. And that goes for most capital ships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, battleships. None of these large vessels during World War II had any sort of anti-submarine abilities inherent to their designs, so they would always be defended by destroyers. And there were a couple of light cruisers that got depth charges and hydroacoustics of one type or another, but they were never really effective the way destroyers were at any submarine warfare.
So you said there was a couple of new changes that we're starting to see in destroyers. So depth charges and their ability to track subs is one. What else makes them so significant? Why do we have so many of them still?
Well, during World War II, they start to get radars added. So now these ships can start scouting for the fleet better. That had previously been the purview of cruisers, which were lighter and faster than battleships, but still 5 times heavier than a World War II destroyer. So these cruisers could go out, and they had tall masts that lookouts at the top could look over the horizon and see enemy ships coming, and then they could report that back to the fleet. Well, with the invention of radar, we can now put those on destroyers and put a picket line of light, cheap destroyers out in front of our fleets, and they can detect the enemy fleets coming from much further away than you can do visually. So electronic sensors, sonar, radar, the torpedoes, of course, that they were built with, the anti-submarine depth charges. Some navies, especially European navies, armed a lot of their destroyers also with rails for carrying mines, so they could race in, mine enemy waterways, and then race back out. That isn't a permanent feature to the type of ship, but it's one of those things that was added. And eventually you get to mission creep, where you're trying to do too much with too light of a platform, and it doesn't do anything really well. So really, electronics, torpedoes, for if you face capital ships, anti-aircraft. So the destroyers being a protective ring around your fleet already to protect against submarines. Throw a couple anti-aircraft guns on there, and now as planes are coming in to hit your battleships or carriers, they first got to go through these destroyers. So all of these things help make them useful.
So, hold on, though. Mm-hmm. Anti-aircraft, we're not worried about that for most of the 20th century. We stopped shooting down airplanes, don't we? And we're not so worried about radar anymore because we can see things from basically anywhere. So why do we still have destroyers today? What is their purpose now that we're not necessarily just using them to scout? I can put a satellite dish out to look for whatever it is I'm looking for. So what is the purpose of the modern destroyer?
Satellites are not effective at tracking enemy warships because they only get a small window of time over a target, and then they orbit out of there, and you've got to wait a day or however long your orbit is for them to come back. And in that time, an enemy task force has moved at 30 miles per hour in any direction, so really hard to find them. It still takes destroyers with radars to be able to track enemy targets so that you've got a firing solution for your own weapons. And destroyers still perform part of the anti-air mission for navies and even whole countries now. So a lot of the Asian countries in particular are very threatened by Chinese or North Korean long-range ballistic missiles. So their destroyers are set up to defend their countries against these missiles, much like an American destroyer is set up to defend the aircraft carrier it's escorting against missiles. They're no longer doing this with anti-aircraft guns. They're doing this with their own missiles.
Do they have Sea-Wiz like we do?
Yes. So here is a modern American Arleigh Burke class destroyer. This is the Flight 1 variant, DDG-51. It has 2 positions for Sea-Wiz, fore and aft. So if you're broadside to a target, both of these guns can engage an oncoming missile. Some destroyers in the Arleigh Burke class only have the aft Sea-Wiz, and some of them, instead of having 20mm phalanxes like Battleship New Jersey, have rolling airframe missiles or other sorts of close-in weapon systems. But generally, they have up to 2 positions. So some other features a modern destroyer has that the Battleship New Jersey has are Harpoon cruise missiles. This one has 2 4-cell launchers, whereas the Battleship has 4 of them. Not all destroyers have these anymore to save weight. A lot of them have been removed from later model Arleigh Burkes. They have a helicopter, or at least a landing pad. This early model does not have a hangar, but later model Arleigh Burkes have this part of the deck is a hangar for up to 2 helicopters. So that's even a feature that New Jersey doesn't have. They have a single 5-inch gun. They have a pair of 25mm chain guns like New Jersey has now in our museum configuration, but never got as a warship. And they have vertical launch tubes here, which carry, among other types of missiles, they're anti-aircraft missiles for one, they also carry Tomahawk cruise missiles like Battleship New Jersey was retrofitted to carry in the 80s. So these can be used against land attack, They can be used for anti-aircraft. They have their own defense. They can be used for anti-shipping. They have torpedo tubes for submarines. These are modern acoustic torpedoes that can home in on submarines. They replace depth charges, and they have a helicopter that can help with any sort of utility work or submarine hunting.
I know this model is not to scale with your other models.
Correct.
How big is this ship?
So an Arleigh Burke destroyer gets up to about 10,000 tons, which is about 1/5 or 1/6 the displacement of an Iowa-class battleship at 57,000 tons. It's the rough displacement of a World War II cruiser. So destroyers have grown from a couple hundred tons to about 1,000 tons by the end of World War II, to about 2,500 tons by 1,000 tons by the end of World War I, 2,500 tons by the end of World War II, and they're up at 10,000 tons today, about the size of cruisers. Why did they do this? Well, because battleships aren't around anymore, and there are only a couple nations left on Earth that still have really, really old cruisers left in their inventory. So destroyers, because of their utility, their relatively low costs, although a modern one costs about $2 billion, are able to endure. They're still being bought and paid for today, whereas these other ships have been phased out because of price and limited utility.
So now that we've gone through the history of destroyers, let's hit some of our favorites. Do you have a favorite destroyer?
Let's see. Always a big fan of the destroyer Johnston. She was one of a group of destroyers during the Battle of Samar that helped fight off a much larger Japanese fleet of battleships and cruisers. Even though destroyers are very susceptible to battleship gunfire, they also carry torpedoes, so they do have a weapon that they can use against battleships.
If you want to know more about the Battle of Samar, we actually made a video specifically about that. We'll tag that into our description as well. One of my favorite destroyer stories, though, of course, is the Typhoon Cobra. You want to talk a little bit about how the destroyers fare during the Typhoon?
Do you want to talk about that?
This is definitely more your area of expertise than mine. It may be my favorite, but...
So, destroyers, being much smaller than a battleship, tend to fare worse in rough weather. Now, they are designed to operate in rough weather, so if the ship is ready for a typhoon, they can weather it. During Halsey's Typhoon in December 44...
December 18th.
Not all of the destroyers in the American fleet were properly ballasted. They had been doing high-speed runs, so they had burned up a lot of their oil. So they were sitting much higher in the water than they were designed to, which meant that in wind and waves, they were rolling a lot more than they were designed to. So that caused a number of problems for them that led to the loss of several destroyers in the fleet.
How did the rest of the ships in the fleet fare?
Most of them had topside gear like radars, masts, aircraft on catapults blown off of the ship or damaged in some way. But large ships like New Jersey survived virtually unscathed. Aircraft carriers, some of them had part of their flight decks collapse, their wooden flight decks, where they were unsupported at the bows. The cruisers got thrown around some, but didn't really take any serious damage.
At least the Monterey had major fires on board as well.
Right, the light carrier Monterey. During a later typhoon, the cruiser Pittsburgh lost her entire bow. So it could damage cruisers, especially the new-built ones that were using the brand-new welding technique as opposed to older style rivets.
Again, if you want to know more about welding versus riveting, we made a video about that too. Also in the description. So, do you have any other favorite destroyers you want to talk about?
Let's see. Other favorite destroyers.
Perhaps something a little bit more modern. We've talked a lot about World War II, but do we see any of them doing anything, say, during Vietnam? I know that having a smaller ship would probably be beneficial in Vietnam. I know they could navigate a little bit better.
Well, the destroyer Turner Joy, which is still a museum ship. Remind me, we'll talk about the museum ships after this. The Turner Joy was one of the first American ships to fire in anger during the Vietnam War, and her action helped get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed that led to the United States actually going to war in Vietnam instead of just being in advisors. So her radar screen was showing North Vietnamese missile boats that may or may not have been there. So the ship takes evasive action. She fires on them, and she calls in that there are that the North Vietnamese are acting hostilely, which leads President Johnston to go before Congress with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution.
So, what is the state of our destroyers right now?
Let's see. We've got 2 destroyer escorts left. Stewart, which is in Galveston, she is closed, and Slater, which is in Albany, New York, she has not been able to reopen from her normal winter closing because the state of New York has closed all non-essential businesses.
For those of you watching a little bit further into the future, right now it is still the early days of our pandemic, so a lot of these museums are closed just because of that. So if you happen to be watching this further into the future, make sure you check their websites, find out what their state is as of your time.
Yeah, so it is currently March 22nd, 2020, and we have been on Coronication now for 6 days, almost a full week, which is why we are filming to you from my library.
Any other destroyers?
Yes. So Fletcher class, you've got Kidd down in Baton Rouge. She was recently the star of the movie Greyhound, based on C.S. Forrester's The Good Shepherd. That movie is set to come out in June of this year, but that may be delayed now because you can't go to movie theaters. Let's see, you've got the Kaysin Young, which is up in Boston. She closed a couple of days ago. You have the Sullivans, which is in Buffalo, and that whole museum closed a couple of days ago.
Anybody else?
Let's see. You've got Edsel. She's up around the Great Lakes somewhere. I haven't heard if she's open or closed. And you've got Turner Joy, which is out in Bremerton, and she's closed for the time being.
Anything else you'd like to share about destroyers?
I can't think of anything at this time.
Any updates on New Jersey that you'd like to share? As of now, we're still closed. Again, told you it's March 22nd today. So stay tuned. We are hoping to reopen as soon as we can. In the meantime, we are posting every day on Facebook and Twitter where we were on this day in 1944. So stay tuned with that. We're posting our daily videos, occasionally from Ryan's library, but also from the ship as well. If you've got any special requests there, we would love your input, so make sure you comment and send us messages. We're also posting daily projects of fun things to do while we're all stuck at home. So check our various social media for that. Anything else you'd like to add?
And make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Check the comment section down below for objects in our store, ways you can support us while we're closed and not making money, more content, that sort of stuff.